Hello again. Today, I want to detail one major issue regarding the failure of Amazon's New World that's been glossed over due to the boatload of other bugs and major issues that doomed the game from the start. A few years ago, Amazon started spending nearly $500 million annually on its game studio. They had a couple other games like Crucible that flopped on launch and are now canceled, but the majority of their money went into their big MMO project titled New World. Now, this game had massive issues right out of the gate, as their suits at the top demanded that they use their own engine, Lumberyard, instead of spending a few dollars for an Unreal or Havoc engine license, which resulted in a broken game with insane exploits as well as graphic card melting issues. But we're gonna set all that ridiculous stuff aside for a minute and look at the other massive reason it was doomed to fail. I've seen people claim that in its alpha it was a terrible mess with no flags and full loot PvP and that it had to be changed. The suits at Amazon even said the same thing, and thus, of course, everybody jumped on board with that. And all the toxic casuals rejoiced about having a new game to play. But the devs knew that their game had already been ruined. You have a massively funded game studio with talented, expensive coders and devs, and they built exactly what they were told to build. You don't just give these people hundreds of millions of dollars and say, okay, go build something cool. We'll come check back in a few years. No, no, no. For a company to spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing a full loot PvP MMO, that took some serious intent and discussion. So the concept of, oopsie, we accidentally made a hardcore PvP game with no real PvE when we really meant to make the exact opposite thing doesn't really make sense. Instead, let me present to you with a harsh truth that I somehow haven't seen presented elsewhere yet. New World was designed to fully be a PvP only game, as their marketing team correctly analyzed that there are hundreds of thousands of PvP focused players out there, and they're looking for a new game to play. They determined this based on the existence of other huge PvP MMOs in the past, as well as PvP games like Fortnite, PUBG, etc. The problem with this is that toxic casuals exist. These people are easily filtered out of shooters, but not from MMOs. So what is a toxic casual? Many people are used to seeing the term toxic elitist thrown around when discussing somebody who trash talks inexperienced players for not being as good at a game as them or using more meta builds, yada yada. And while these people may be annoying, and there may seem to be a lot of them, let me introduce you to the toxic casual. Toxic casuals are players who demand to win regardless of skill or effort involved, and they collectively influence developers and marketers, which can have drastic consequences for the game itself and the gamers who play it. There are a lot of different kind of toxic casuals, but the most destructive kind overall are the kind of people who are so entitled that they demand all games change to fit their casual playstyle. They themselves can't even really be blamed for the huge damage they cause, as they're just people who are looking for fun, but are too stupid to find it. Before diving directly into New World, I'm going to give some examples of a few other games that have been negatively affected by toxic casuals. Sea of Thieves is a game about being a pirate and acquiring treasure by either digging it up or sinking other players and pirating their loot. Immediately after launch, the forums got flooded with whine threads about people getting their loot stolen, oh no, and what they deemed as getting griefed, quote unquote. The demand for private servers and PvE only servers and bans for the terrible pirates who had been stealing people's loot began mounting on the forums, and the devs, despite the entire point of the game being about piracy, they relented and allowed ships to alliance, so the groups could fill an entire server with friendly players and peacefully sing songs and sail around avoiding any potential for piracy. Dead by Daylight's another example of a game with a huge toxic casual problem. The game's population's healthy, but it's so massively imbalanced that survivor players wait in queues for sometimes 10 to 15 minutes at a time, while killer players get instant queues. Despite the only mode of play being one killer per four survivors, there's just not enough killers willing to queue due to constant killer nerfs over the years to the point that it's just not worth it. The reason for this is because toxic casuals make up a massive percentage of the survivor only crowd, and they flood forums with demands that the devs nerf killers who kill them, as if that wasn't what they were supposed to do. The devs have stated numerous times on official channels that things like camping, tunneling, slugging, etc. are all valid killer tactics or strategies that shouldn't be reported. The reason they have to word it like that is because these toxic casuals absolutely refuse to accept the dev's word on their own game, and prefer to be toxic toward a killer for killing them, including spamming reports about them. The behavior devs struggle to maintain balance while knowing that they have to appeal to an 80-20 population due to the game being a 4v1, resulting in the killer getting the short end of the stick every time. Now logically, you'd think they would easily solve this by offering rewards to people for playing killer, but they're too scared to offer them, because when they discussed it, the toxic casuals collectively threatened to review bomb their game in an attempt to terrorize the devs into complying with their demands. It's kinda bananas, but it worked, as the devs have been too scared to fix the problem for years. Elder Scrolls Online is another game that got completely devastated by toxic casuals. At its launch, it was a massive MMO whose endgame was 100% PvP. There were 0 raids. The best gear could be crafted, and the endgame zone was full PvP, and the zone had 3 multi-million-dollar CGI videos that made up the majority of the entire advertisement for the game devoted to it. They also made sure that every major gaming journalism outlet talked specifically about their PvP. Then, during the beta, toxic casuals, who were used to winning fights via zerging, they got rolled by skilled smaller groups and demanded that ZeniMax give them an immunity to damage while they're with a big group. Because as a toxic casual, numbers should win, not skill. No, numbers. Casuals had gotten used to crutching on things like an AE cap from previous games like Guild Wars 2 or Warhammer Online, where they could just stack up a shitload of people and become pretty much invincible. Threats by huge casual guilds that they're all going to quit if this isn't fixed, quote unquote, began literally on day 1 of the beta, and due to ZeniMax having 0 balls or experience in the subject of dealing with toxic casuals, they caved immediately, and by the end of the beta, slipped in an AE cap, where players could only hit a total of 6 people with each attack, resulting in tight stack groups becoming the meta, where dozens of people would just blob around as one big invincible group, which completely killed all quality PvP, and thus the vast majority of the PvPers left. Then, seeing that all the PvP players were leaving, instead of having the balls to admit they fucked up and fix it, no, they doubled down and said, oh, well, I guess we'll then switch the entire endgame over to PvE, because that is easier to do than admit they fucked up by listening to toxic casuals. Somehow, the preservation of their ego was worth the loss of 90% of their original player base and the desperate rush to create an entire PvE endgame while bleeding players for months at a time they called a rough launch. And lastly, the Dark Souls series is one I want to point out that's been handled very, very well by their devs. They just completely ignore the toxic casuals that have been demanding for years that they just have to add an easy mode or nerf the difficulty completely so that casuals can beat the game, or it's gonna die. They've been saying this for literally a decade. From Software just laughs at them and makes more Souls games, and they get glowing reviews from the majority of the industry for it. We even coined a new term from the whole thing, Get Good. And this Get Good concept has literally carried From Software through like 5 or 6 games now, where nobody really gives a shit about the plot, the characters, the setting, yada yada, because it's all bananas. We just like a good challenge, and that they provide. Now that we've established what toxic casuals are about, let's take a look at New World. Allow me to present an alternative storyline to what you may have heard. The game that they created was a massively funded, hardcore, full-loot PvP MMO, and it was advertised as such. Invites for the closed alpha went out to people who applied for them. Toxic casuals have a problem with not being included in stuff. Like I said earlier, they cannot fathom the concept that they just simply aren't very good at competitive games and thus probably shouldn't be playing them. Thus, the toxic casuals applied for the alpha knowing full well it was a PvP game. The result, as you may imagine, was the real PvP players having a field day wiping the floor with thousands of casual sheep who had zero chance to win against experienced players. To a PvP player, the alpha went really well, as expected, and they were looking forward to more. Unfortunately for them and the devs, the toxic casuals then flooded forums and social media that game broken, PvP players, they killed us, they griefed us, look at all this pile of dead bodies, fix it. This resulted in some non-game playing suits at Amazon getting involved and coming downstairs to demand that the devs get rid of this terrible nonsense they're seeing on social media about players getting griefed in New World. When they were told that the game was specifically aimed at PvP players instead of everybody and their grandmother, they were shocked that their devs didn't think of profits over quality gameplay. The suits demanded that the devs change the entire game from PvP to PvE in a few months, which included making an entire PvE endgame. Thus, the game's PvE endgame turned out to be garbage, because gosh golly, as it turns out, it requires more than just a few months to crank that kind of shit out. Now, the argument's been thrown around that because there are more PvE players and casuals out there than PvP players, then logically, New World should be changed into a PvE game. And by that ridiculous logic, so should all the games, Dota, everything. Everything should just be a PvE only game. And that way everybody can be a winner and everybody gets chicken dinners, including the bus driver. And just, it's all a big fun thing. Because, competition, it's awful. It's awful. Let's get rid of that. What's baffling to me is that PvP players don't go into PvE games and start demanding that they add PvP. We just don't play them. Why would we? And there are, of course, far more PvE players and casuals out there than PvP players, but that doesn't mean that New World wouldn't have possibly enjoyed success with hundreds of thousands of PvPers out there, because there are a lot of them. But PvP players aren't casuals. They don't buy games if there isn't quality PvP to be had. And thus most of them dodge New World completely. And since the PvE is also ridiculously shallow, 90% of the game's populations quit within just a few months, and they continue to lose more players every single day as the population circles the drain. And now I don't usually go defending devs when their games fail. It's just not like me. I'm usually the bad guy. However, these specific devs got royally fucked over. These devs knew exactly what they were supposed to make. A PvP game. That's what they were told to make. PvP-focused game developers know to expect some criticism, because even PvP players can get whiny sometimes when they lose fights. But they don't then demand the removal of PvP, so no big deal there. However, what they did not expect was to have Amazon suits come downstairs and get involved, and tell them that because of all this criticism from toxic casuals who shouldn't have even downloaded the fucking game, that they're going to need to scrap the entire project's focus and to shift the entire thing over to PvE, which meant spending all of the time between then and release cranking out shallow, bare-bones PvE content instead of doing the polishing that they were supposed to be doing during those last few months of development. I hope that after spending years building exactly what they were told to build and then having their project taken from them and Frankensteined into the exact opposite of what they were trying to build it for, that these people are not let go when the project inevitably fails, as if it was their fault somehow. That would be a tragedy. And they can't really tell their story. They're simply not allowed to without jeopardizing what I'm sure is an amazing job. But it is an important story for the industry going forward. So there it is. Toxic casuals are a plague on the entire gaming industry, and it's not going to get better either, as it's far more convenient and profitable in the short term to cave to the demands of the vocal majority, even if it's bad for the game itself in the long term. As noted in their original design, which was the reason that the game was made, there is a massive amount of PvP focused players out there. They simply require a PvP environment where the devs have the balls to not cave to the demands of toxic casuals the second they lose a fight in a game they shouldn't even be playing. Thanks for stopping by and have a great day.